They called her Ash. It was not her name, but it was all she was. The soot on her cheeks, the grime under her nails, the gray of her threadbare tunic. She was the ash left behind when the fire of a family died out, a smudge on the clean stone floors of the Silverwood Pack Hall. Cold was her constant companion. It seeped through the cracks in the walls of her tiny servant's closet. It lived in the damp flagstones she scrubbed on her hands and knees, a merciless chill that bit at her bones and never truly left. Today, the cold was a predator. A blizzard, the elders called it, the worst in a generation. It screamed outside the thick walls, a phantom wolf howling for entry. Inside, the great hall was a bubble of warmth and light, filled with the scent of roasting meat and spiced wine. For them, not for her. Her world was the long, drafty corridor that led to the kitchens. Her task was to keep the floor clear of the slush and mud tracked in by guards returning from their patrols. The bucket of icy water sloshed against her shins, each splash a fresh shock of misery. Her hands were raw, chapped red and white by the lye soap and the relentless cold. Pain was a familiar language. It was the ache in her back, the burn in her knuckles, the hollow gnawing in her belly. She was always hungry. The pack ate first, the highest ranking down to the lowest born. By the time the scraps reached the servants, there was little left but gristle and bone. She was less than a servant. She was an omega, an orphan taken in out of a pity that had long since curdled into resentment. Her parents had been from a rival pack, cast out and left to die in the wilds for a crime no one ever spoke of. The Silverwood Alpha had found her as a babe, a squalling bundle in the snow, and his mercy had been her life sentence. She was a ghost at her own life's feast, invisible until someone needed something to kick.
Ash, are you deaf as well as useless?
The voice, sharp and cruel as shattered ice, belonged to Lyra. She was the daughter of the pack's beta, beautiful and adored, and she despised Alara with a passion that was almost religious in its fervor. Alara's real name was a forgotten whisper, a secret she held tight in the desolate quiet of her own mind. Alara flinched, pulling her head up. Lyra stood with her hands on her hips, her fine wool cloak dusted with perfect, glittering snowflakes. She looked like a winter princess. Alara, kneeling in a puddle of dirty water, felt like a troll.
The floor is still filthy,
Lyra sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a spot Alara had just scrubbed.
Are you trying to make the entire hall smell like wet dog? Or is that just you?
Laughter echoed from the two warriors flanking her. The sound was sharp and mocking, each note a tiny stone thrown at her. Humiliation burned hot in Alara's cheeks, a stark contrast to the cold that consumed the rest of her. She said nothing, just dipped her rag back into the freezing water. What was there to say? Arguing would only earn her a slap, or worse, no food at all tonight. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul.
Look at me when I'm speaking to you, filth!
Lyra's boot nudged Alara's ribs. It was not a hard kick, not enough to break anything, but it was packed with contempt. Alara gritted her teeth, the muscle in her jaw jumping. She lifted her gaze, meeting Lyra's cold blue eyes. For a fraction of a second, something hard and defiant flickered in her own gray depths. A spark, not of ash, but of ember. It was a stubborn refusal to completely break, a tiny kernel of strength she did not know she possessed. The spark died as quickly as it came, smothered by years of submission. She lowered her head. My apologies, Lyra. I will scrub it again. Lyra seemed disappointed by her compliance. She preferred a struggle. With a sound of disgust, she kicked the bucket. Icy, filthy water cascaded over Alara's lap and legs, soaking her thin tunic and leggings instantly. The cold was so intense it was like a physical blow, stealing her breath. "Do it right this time," Lyra snapped, before turning on her heel and sweeping back toward the warmth and light of the great hall, her guards laughing as they followed. Alara stayed there, kneeling in the spreading puddle, shivering uncontrollably. The cold was no longer just a companion. It was inside her now, a solid block of ice in her chest. Despair was a bitter taste on her tongue. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she wished the blizzard would just smash through the walls and take them all. Take her. But the stubborn little spark inside her flickered again. No, she would not let them break her. Not today. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin of ice. She would have to finish her work. There was no other choice. There was never another choice. An hour later, a summons came. It was one of Lyra's lackeys, a burly warrior named Yorn. His lip was curled in a permanent sneer. "Lyra wants more firewood for her chambers," he grunted, not bothering to look at her. "The main shed is almost empty. You'll have to go to the old woodsman's pile." Alara's heart sank. The old woodsman's pile was a quarter-mile into the forest, past the edge of the main compound. In this storm, it was a death sentence. "But the blizzard," she whispered, her voice trembling. Yorn finally looked at her, his eyes flat and merciless. "Are you refusing a direct order from the Beta's daughter? The Alpha is away. She speaks with his authority," he smirked. "Besides, a little cold shouldn't bother you. You're already half frozen." Fear, cold and sharp, sliced through her. This was not a task. It was a punishment. It was Lyra's way of getting rid of the filth once and for all. No one would even look for her until the storm passed. By then, she would be just another snowdrift. But she had no choice. Refusal meant a public beating, and then being thrown out into the storm anyway. At least this way, she could pretend she had a chance. She wrapped her thin, worn cloak around her shoulders. It was practically useless against the wind, but it was all she had. She did not say goodbye to anyone. There was no one to say goodbye to. The moment she pushed open the heavy side door, the storm attacked. The wind was a solid wall of force, armed with claws of ice and snow. It ripped the breath from her lungs and tried to tear the cloak from her back. The world vanished into a screaming vortex of white. She bowed her head, pulling the hood down, and forced one foot in front of the other. The path to the woodsman's pile was usually clear. Now it was buried under 3 feet of snow. Every step was a struggle, her legs sinking deep into the powder, the effort stealing her warmth and strength. Within minutes, she was completely disoriented. The compound lights vanished behind her. The trees were just gray phantoms in the swirling chaos. The howling of the wind was the only sound, a deafening roar that vibrated in her bones. Was she going the right way? She could no longer tell. Panic began to bubble in her chest, hot and frantic. She tried to turn back, but she could not tell which way back was. Every direction looked the same. A terrifying, endless white. She was falling. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she plunged face first into a deep drift. The snow was soft but suffocating. It filled her mouth and nose, and for a terrifying moment, she could not breathe. She thrashed, pushing herself up, gasping and coughing. Her cloak's hood had been thrown back. The wind tore at her hair, and ice crystals stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She was lost, utterly and completely lost. A strange resignation began to settle over her. This was it then. This was how her small, miserable life would end, not with a bang, but with a slow, freezing whimper in the heart of a storm. It was almost peaceful. The pain in her hands and feet was fading into a dull numbness. Her shivering was starting to subside. She knew what that meant. She sank to her knees, the fight draining out of her. It would be so easy to just lie down, to close her eyes and let the snow cover her like a blanket, to finally be warm in the cold. Then she smelled it. Through the clean, sharp scent of the winter storm, another smell drifted. It was coppery and raw. Blood. And beneath it, the dark, rich scent of pine and something else. Something wild and powerful. Something distinctly male. Curiosity, a long dormant instinct, stirred within her. Who else would be out in this? She forced herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She stumbled forward, following the scent, her movements clumsy and slow. She pushed through a thicket of snow-laden branches and into a small sheltered clearing, a pocket of relative calm protected by ancient fir trees. And she saw him. He was a mountain of a man, propped against the trunk of the largest fir. His cloak, made of some dark, heavy fur, was thrown open. A massive, jagged wound marred his side, a gash so deep she could see the glint of bone beneath. The snow around him was stained a horrifying, brilliant crimson. Around him lay the bodies of 3 grotesque creatures. They were vaguely wolf-like but wrong, their limbs too long, their fur the color of shadow, their mouths filled with teeth like obsidian shards. One of them had a massive silver-tipped arrow sticking out of its throat. Even injured, the man radiated an aura of pure, undiluted power. It pressed on her, heavy and intimidating, a physical force in the air. His head was bowed, his face obscured by a cascade of long, night-black hair. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow, ragged things. She knew who he was. Every wolf shifter in the territory knew of him. The stories were whispered in hushed, awed tones. Kale, the alpha king of all packs, a ruler so ancient and powerful he was more myth than man. The one the Silverwood Alpha served. The one who was supposed to be away, mediating a dispute in the southern territories. What was he doing here? Wounded and alone? Fear screamed at her to run, to turn and flee back into the storm. This was a predator of a kind she could not even comprehend. Being near him felt like standing at the edge of a volcano. But he was dying. The healer's instinct she never knew she had, a gentle pulse deep within her, overrode the fear. It was the same instinct that made her bind a bird's broken wing or share her meager rations with a starving stray. She could not just leave him here to bleed out in the snow. Hesitantly, she took a step closer. Then another. The snow crunched under her boots, the sound loud in the sheltered quiet of the clearing. His head snapped up, and she found herself staring into eyes of molten gold. They were not just yellow or amber. They were liquid fire, glowing with an inner light that seemed impossibly bright in the storm-darkened afternoon. They fixed on her, sharp and piercing, the eyes of a hunter assessing its prey. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. All thoughts of helping him vanished, replaced by a primal terror. He was the apex, the ultimate authority, and she was nothing, less than nothing. He tried to push himself up, a low growl rumbling in his chest, deep as thunder. The movement made him gasp, his hand flying to the wound in his side. A fresh wave of blood welled up, shockingly dark against his pale skin. His golden eyes clouded with pain, the fierce light dimming. He slumped back against the tree, his head lolling. He was weaker than he looked. Much weaker. The fear receded, replaced again by that strange, compelling urge to help. She was still terrified, but the sight of his pain was a hook in her heart. She moved slowly, her hands held out in a gesture of peace, as if approaching a wounded wolf. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy in the cold air. He watched her, his gaze wary, but he did not have the strength to snarl again. His breathing was growing more labored. He was going into shock. She knelt beside him in the blood-soaked snow, her own freezing misery forgotten. The wound was horrific. It looked like it had been torn by the claws of one of those shadow creatures. It was jagged and deep, and it was not clotting. Poison, maybe. "I have to clean it," she said, more to herself than to him. Her cloak was useless, wet and frozen. Her tunic was already soaked. She looked at the hem of her undertunic, the only piece of cloth on her that was still relatively clean and dry. Without a second thought, she tore a long strip from it. The sound of the ripping fabric was stark and loud. He flinched but did not protest. His golden eyes followed her every move. She hesitated for only a moment, then leaned forward. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. What was she doing? She, the nameless Omega, was about to touch the Alpha King. It was sacrilege. It was suicide. But her hands moved with a will of their own. She gently, so gently, pressed the clean strip of cloth to the edges of the gash, trying to wipe away the blood and get a better look. The instant her fingers brushed against his skin, the world exploded. It was not a sound. It was a feeling. A bolt of pure white-hot lightning shot up her arm, straight into her chest, and detonated behind her eyes. The air crackled. The scent of ozone and summer rain filled her senses, overpowering the smell of blood and pine. A wave of energy, potent and overwhelming, surged from him into her. She cried out, a sharp gasp of shock and pain. A searing heat erupted on the back of her right wrist, a burning agony so intense it felt like a hot brand was being pressed into her flesh. She tried to pull away, but she could not. It felt like she was physically fused to him. Through the blinding light in her mind, she saw images, felt emotions that were not her own. 1,000 years of solitude, the crushing weight of a crown. A desperate, soul-deep loneliness that was a chasm of black ice. A long, unending search for something, for someone. A scent of winter roses and wood smoke. Her scent. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. She was left gasping, trembling, kneeling in the snow. The world slowly swam back into focus. The only remnants of the cataclysm were the lingering scent of ozone and the vicious, throbbing pain in her wrist. She dared to look down. There, on the pale skin of her wrist, was a mark that had not been there a moment before. It was a complex, beautiful spiral of shimmering silver and gold lines, interwoven like thread, glowing with a soft internal light. It looked ancient and magical. It looked like it belonged there. What was happening to me? Before she could process it, a hand shot out and clamped around her marked wrist. It was his hand, large, calloused, and impossibly strong even now. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute, unbreakable. She looked up into his face. His eyes were no longer just molten gold. They were blazing. Supernovas of power and emotion, awe, disbelief, and a possessiveness so profound, so absolute, it stole the air from her lungs. His lips parted. His voice was no longer a growl, but a raw, ragged whisper,
filled with 1,000 years of waiting. You. The single word hung in the frozen air, heavy with meaning she could not comprehend. He tugged gently on her wrist, pulling her closer until her face was only inches from his. His gaze dropped to the glowing mark, then back to her terrified eyes. A slow, wondering smile touched his lips, a breathtaking sight on his harsh, predatorily beautiful face. It was like watching the sun rise after a lifetime of darkness. Mine, he breathed. And then the fire in his eyes finally dimmed, and he slumped into unconsciousness, his hand still locked around her wrist. Alara stared at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Terror, confusion, and a strange, terrifying thread of something else. Something that felt like coming home, warred within her. The glowing mark on her wrist throbbed in time with her pulse, a permanent, undeniable brand. She was no longer just Ash. She was his. And she had no idea what that meant. Kale was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. It took all of her waning strength, but somehow she managed to half drag, half carry him the few yards to a shallow cave she had noticed earlier, a dark slash in the rock face almost hidden by snowdrifts. The space was small and cramped, but it was out of the wind. The bond, or whatever the terrifying connection was, hummed between them. The contact of his hand on her wrist had faded to a dull warmth, but the mark itself still pulsed with a soft light, a beacon in the gloom of the cave. Even in his unconscious state, his grip had not loosened. She looked at his face in the dim light. The harsh lines were softened in repose. He was younger than the legend suggested, yet ancient wisdom was carved into the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the proud set of his jaw. A stray lock of black hair fell across his forehead, and without thinking, she reached out with her free hand and brushed it away. Her fingers trembled as they grazed his skin. The wound was still the most pressing issue. He would die if she did not stop the bleeding. With her hand still captive, her range of motion was limited. She shuffled closer, her hip pressing against his. A jolt, less violent than the first but just as potent, shot through her. It was warmth. Not the searing heat of the branding, but a deep, pervasive warmth that pushed back against the ice in her veins. She needed more bandages, clean water, maybe some healing herbs from the pack stores. But she could not leave him. Not just because he was physically holding her, but because the thought of leaving him now sent a spike of pure panic through her. It felt wrong. It felt like leaving a part of herself behind. Using her teeth and her one free hand, she tore more strips from her undertunic until the hem was a ragged mess. She pressed them firmly against the gash, applying pressure. His blood, warm and thick, soaked through the thin fabric almost immediately, coating her fingers. The scent was dizzying, powerful. She worked in a trance, her terror giving way to a focused determination. She packed the wound as best she could, creating a thick pressure bandage. His breathing seemed to even out, the ragged gasps smoothing into deeper, steadier breaths. Hours passed. The storm raged on outside their small sanctuary. The light faded from gray to a deep, bruised purple, and then to black. The cold in the cave was intense, but where her body was pressed against his, a strange, shared warmth persisted. The bond was a low thrum beneath her skin, a constant, living presence. Sometime in the dead of night, he stirred. His grip on her wrist tightened, and a low moan escaped his lips. His golden eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and confusion. They found hers in the darkness. "Cold," he rasped, his voice rough. He was shivering, his powerful frame trembling against hers. The blood loss was making him susceptible to the cold. She, who had lived her whole life in a state of perpetual chill, knew this enemy well. "I know," she whispered. She did the only thing she could think of. She shuffled even closer, draping her own thin, damp cloak over his chest and pressing the length of her body against his side. It was a pathetic offering, but it was all she had. "I'm sorry. It's all I have." He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted, turning toward her and pulling her flush against his chest. His free arm came around her, tucking her head under his chin. He was still holding her wrist, trapping her hand between their bodies. It was an embrace born of necessity, of shared warmth, but it felt intimate, terrifyingly so. She went rigid, her entire body tensing for a blow that didn't come. This close, she could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear. She could smell the pine and wildness of him, mixed with the sharp tang of his blood. "Stay," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her hair. It was not a request. It was a soft command, an absolute statement of fact. She did not have the will or the strength to argue. Tucked against the Alpha King, she felt a flicker of something she had never known. Safety. The ice block in her chest began to melt at the edges. Exhausted, terrified, and utterly bewildered, Alara closed her eyes and, for the first time in her life, fell asleep in the arms of another. When she woke, it was to a sliver of pale morning light filtering into the cave. The storm had broken. Kale was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. At some point in the night, his grip on her wrist had finally relaxed. Her first thought was of the pack. They would find her missing. Maybe they would not care, but they would notice. She needed to get back before her absence caused more trouble than it was worth. She also needed real medical supplies for him. The makeshift bandage was soaked through. Carefully, she extricated herself from his arms. The loss of his warmth was immediate and jarring. The cave felt 10 degrees colder without it. She looked at the mark on her wrist. In the daylight, it was less luminous, a delicate, intricate tattoo of silver and gold woven into her skin. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. She crept out of the cave. The world was transformed, blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of white. The air was clean and cold. From the rock outcropping, she could see the familiar smudge of smoke from the pack hall in the distance. She was not as far as she had thought. A plan, desperate and flimsy, formed in her mind. She would sneak back into the compound, steal herbs and bandages from the healer's stores, and return before anyone was the wiser. It was risky. If she were caught stealing, she would be whipped. But leaving him to die was not an option. Her soul, somehow, would not allow it. Getting back was easier than getting lost. She followed her own tracks, faint as they were, and managed to slip into the compound through the same side door she had left. The halls were quiet. It was early. Most of the pack was still sleeping late after the storm. She crept to the healer's room, her heart pounding. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside, her eyes darting around the small, herb-scented space. She grabbed a handful of blood-clotting moss, a pouch of pain-dulling willow bark, and clean linen bandages, stuffing them into the front of her tunic. As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her cold. "And where have you been, Ash?" Alara's blood turned to ice. Lyra stood in the doorway, blocking her exit. She was already dressed in fine furs, her hair perfectly braided. An accusatory, triumphant gleam was in her eyes. I was gathering more wood, Alara stammered, trying to hide the bulge under her tunic. In the middle of the night? During the worst blizzard in memory? Lyra's smile was a thin, cruel line. You were gone all night. I had Yorn check your closet. You never came back. We all thought you had finally done us a favor and frozen to death. Alara said nothing, her mind racing. She was caught. What are you hiding? Lyra's eyes narrowed, her gaze dropping to Alara's tunic. She stepped forward, her hand shooting out to grab the front of Alara's clothing. Alara instinctively jerked back, pulling her arm up to defend herself. The movement was too quick. The ragged sleeve of her tunic slid down, exposing her wrist, exposing the mark. In the dim light of the corridor, the silver and gold lines seemed to catch the faint light, shimmering with an otherworldly beauty. Lyra's breath hitched. She froze, her blue eyes widening in shock as she stared at the intricate spiral. The legends were known to all highborn shifters. The signs, the portents, the ancient laws. She knew exactly what that mark meant. The Gisla, the soul brand, the mark of a fated mate, a mark that only appeared when one found their other half, and it was a mark reserved for the most powerful of bloodlines. For a moment, pure, unadulterated disbelief warred on Lyra's face. Then, it was replaced by a look of such intense, venomous jealousy that Alara physically recoiled. Lyra's gaze flicked from the mark on Alara's wrist to her face, then back again. Understanding, cold and sharp, dawned in her eyes. The Alpha King was missing. He had not been seen since before the storm, and this filth, this Omega nobody, had been gone all night and returned with the mark of a king's mate on her skin. It was impossible. It was obscene. It was an insult to everything Lyra believed about bloodlines and worth. That mark should have been hers, or someone like her, not this. What have you done? Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and awe. Alara snatched her hand back, pulling her sleeve down, but it was too late. The secret was out. It's nothing, she lied, her voice shaking. It's just a burn. Liar, Lyra hissed. Her eyes were alight with a feverish, calculating fire. The initial shock was already hardening into a cold, sharp ambition. This changed everything. This worthless piece of ash suddenly held an incredible, impossible value. She was a key, a weakness, a tool to be used. Lyra's mind, always sharp when it came to power and position, raced. The Alpha King was powerful, untouchable. But a mate, a fated mate, was a vulnerability, especially one so weak and worthless as this girl. Control her, and you had leverage over a god. And Lyra knew just who would pay a king's ransom for that kind of leverage. The whispers of a shadowy faction, a group that sought to usurp the old powers, were getting louder. The Ember Covenant, they called themselves. They moved in the dark, and their ambition was to see the Alpha King fall. A slow, predatory smile spread across Lyra's face. This was better than seeing Alara freeze to death. This was so much better. This was a path to power she had never dreamed of. You're right, Lyra said, her voice suddenly smooth as silk, a chilling contrast to the venom in her eyes. It's nothing. You should get back to your duties. Don't let me keep you. She stepped aside, gesturing down the hall. The sudden change in demeanor was more terrifying than her open hostility. Alara didn't trust it for a second. She scurried past Lyra, clutching the stolen supplies, her heart hammering with a new kind of dread. She did not see the dark, triumphant smile on Lyra's face as she watched her go. She did not see Lyra turn and walk purposefully toward the rookery, where the dark feathered messenger ravens were kept. Ravens that flew farther and faster than any others, carrying messages to those who paid well for secrets. Lyra had a secret to sell, the biggest secret in 1,000 years, and she knew the price would be immense. Alara ran. She did not stop until the compound was far behind her, her lungs burning, the stolen supplies clutched tight against her chest. The look in Lyra's eyes had terrified her more than any beating. It was a look of cold, hard calculation. Lyra knew, and she would use it. Against who, for what, Alara did not know. But she knew it would mean ruin. She scrambled back into the cave, her breath coming in ragged pants. Kale was awake. He had pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the rock wall. His golden eyes, sharp and clear, were fixed on the cave entrance, waiting for her. "You came back," he said. His voice was stronger now, a low baritone that resonated in the small space. "You're still bleeding," she replied, avoiding his intense gaze. She knelt and unwrapped the blood-soaked rags from his wound. The gash was still an angry red, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with a piece of linen dipped in melted snow, her movements deft and sure. She crushed the willow bark and mixed it with a little water to make a paste for the pain, then packed the gash with the blood-clotting moss before binding it tightly with the clean bandages. He watched her the entire time, his silence a heavy weight. His gaze was unnerving, as if he could see right through her skin, past the dirt and fear, and into the trembling core of her. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her task complete. She kept her eyes down, suddenly hyper-aware of her filthy tunic, her chapped hands, the grime under her nails. She was a scavenger, a thing of dirt and shadow, and he was him. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice soft. She flinched. No one had asked for her real name in years. "They call me Ash," she whispered. "That is not a name. That is a penance," he stated, his voice flat. "What is your name?" She hesitated, then breathed the word she had kept locked away for so long. "Alara." "Alara," he repeated, and the sound of her own name on his tongue was a strange sort of magic. It sounded real. It sounded beautiful. "It means light." She looked up at him, startled. She had never known that. He reached out, his fingers gently touching the glowing mark on her wrist. A jolt of warmth, pleasant and deep, pulsed through her. "You are the other half of my soul, Alara, the one I have waited a millennium to find." Her mind reeled. Soul, mate, king. It was too much. It was a fairy tale, and she was the scullery maid who had stumbled into the wrong story. I don't understand," she stammered. "I'm nobody. I'm an omega, a cast-off." "You are mine," he said, his voice laced with an undeniable certainty that left no room for argument. "That is all that matters. The pack you came from, the rank they gave you, it is dust. It means nothing." He started to push himself to his feet, using the wall for support. He was still weak, but the iron will that had kept him alive was now focused on moving. "What are you doing?" she asked, alarmed. "Taking you home," he said simply. "To my home, where you belong." Before she could protest, before she could voice the 1,000 fears screaming in her head, a shadow fell over the mouth of the cave. 3 figures stood there, silhouetted against the bright snow. They were dressed in black leather and dark gray cloaks, their faces hidden by deep hoods.
They moved with an unnatural silence, and the air around them grew cold, carrying a faint scent of burnt embers and decay. These were not pack warriors. Kale instinctively moved to stand in front of her, shielding her with his body. A low growl started in his chest. "Ember Covenant," he snarled. "Lord Kale," the lead figure said, his voice smooth and chillingly pleasant. He pulled back his hood, revealing a pale, handsome face marred by a ritualistic scar that coiled around one eye. This was not the main leader, but a high-ranking lieutenant. "A pleasure to find you so indisposed. Malachor sends his regards." "What do you want, carrion eater?" Kale's voice was pure ice. The man's eyes flickered past Kale to where Alara was cowering. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Our master has a new interest. We were sent for the girl." Kale's growl deepened into a feral roar. "You will not touch her." "We have no wish to fight you. Not today," the man said calmly. "But we will have her. The easy way." He gestured, and his two companions produced heavy chains made of a dull gray metal, silver. "Or the hard way." Rage, pure and primal, flashed in Kale's eyes. He launched himself forward, a blur of motion despite his injury. He was a force of nature, a storm of claws and fury. He took down one of the assassins in a heartbeat, a savage tear of his claws silencing the man forever. But he was wounded. He was slow. As he turned on the second, the leader moved with blinding speed. He did not attack Kale directly. He lunged for Ilara. She screamed as his hand, cold as a corpse, closed around her arm. He yanked her forward, using her as a shield. "Stop!" the assassin yelled, holding a silver knife to her throat. "Or she dies!" Kale froze, his body coiled, his face a mask of incandescent fury. His golden eyes were locked on the blade at her throat. He was trapped. "Let her go," he snarled, his voice shaking with restrained violence. "She is the key, Your Majesty," the man sneered. "Our master has plans for her. Plans for you both." While Kale was distracted, the third assassin lunged, not with a weapon but with the silver chains. He managed to whip them around Kale's arms, binding him. The moment the silver touched his skin, Kale roared in agony. It burned him, sapping his strength, smothering his power. He fought, straining against the chains, but the poison and the blood loss had taken too much of a toll. "No!" Alara cried, struggling against her captor. The leader laughed. He pressed a cloth to her face. It smelled sweet and cloying. Her head swam. The world tilted, the colors smearing at the edges. The last thing she saw was Kael, on his knees, fighting helplessly against the silver chains, his golden eyes filled with a desperate, furious light fixed on her. The last thing she felt was the bond, not as a warmth, but as a tearing, ripping agony as she was pulled away from him. Then, darkness swallowed her whole. She awoke to pain. It was a cold, gnawing ache that had settled deep in her bones, centered on her wrist. She was in a cell, a place of damp stone and absolute darkness. The air was frigid and smelled of mildew and despair. Heavy manacles were clamped around her wrists. They were made of the same dull gray metal as the chains, silver. Where the cuff on her right wrist pressed against her soul brand, the pain was excruciating. It was a constant, burning agony. But worse than the physical pain was the feeling of emptiness. The bond, the constant warm hum of Kael's presence, was gone. It had been smothered by the silver, leaving a void in her soul so vast and terrifying it felt like a mortal wound. She was alone again, more alone than she had ever been in her life.
Days or hours passed, she could not tell. There was no light, no sound but the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. They gave her stale bread and foul water, just enough to keep her alive. The despair was a physical weight crushing her. She had tasted hope for a single day, and now it had been ripped away, leaving a wound far deeper than any Lyra had ever inflicted. Lyra. This was her fault. Her betrayal had led them here. The thought was a bitter stone in her gut. Eventually, the heavy door to her cell scraped open, spilling jarring torchlight into her prison. A tall, elegant figure stood in the doorway, his form casting a long, distorted shadow. He was unnervingly handsome, with silver hair and eyes the color of a frozen lake. He radiated a cold, quiet power that was a chilling mockery of Kale's vital warmth. This was Malachor, the Shadow King, the leader of the Ember Covenant. "The Sunstone," he said, his voice a silken whisper that slid over her skin like a spider. "You are less impressive in person." He glided into the cell, circling her like a shark. "Do you know what you are, beyond the Alpha King's newfound pet?" Alara pressed herself back against the damp wall, saying nothing. "You are a catalyst," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "A linchpin. For a millennium, the Alpha Kings have drawn their ultimate power from the very soul of this land. But that power requires an anchor, a fated mate, a queen. Without one, the king is diminished, his connection frayed. Kale has been without his anchor for his entire long, lonely reign. Until you." He stopped in front of her, his cold eyes boring into hers. "His finding you has made him stronger than ever. But it has also given him a weakness, a pressure point. The bond can be a source of great power, but it can also be severed. And when it is severed violently," he smiled, a chilling, razor-thin expression, "the backlash will shatter his connection to the land. It will cripple him, leave him hollowed out and broken. An empty throne for a new king to claim." Her blood ran cold. They were not just using her as a hostage. They were going to use her to destroy Kale. "The ritual requires the Sunstone. That is what the old texts call your kind, a being of latent light. To be willing," he murmured, tracing the line of her jaw with one icy finger. She flinched away. "But willing is a flexible term. Pain and despair can make a person willing to do anything to make it stop." He looked at the silver manacle on her wrist. "This is just a taste. The ritual itself will feel like your soul is being torn in two. Because it is." He left her then, plunging her back into darkness and a despair so profound it was almost a physical entity. He was right. The pain from the severed bond, the cold, the hunger, it was all eroding her will. The stubborn spark that had kept her going was flickering, threatening to die out completely. She curled into a ball on the floor, wrapping her arms around herself, and wept. She had been worthless. And now her only worth was as a weapon to destroy the one person who had ever looked at her and seen someone. As she lay there, broken and sobbing, a faint warmth touched the edge of her consciousness. It was a tiny flicker in the vast, cold emptiness, almost imperceptible. She focused on it, clinging to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It grew stronger, a thread of golden light spinning through the suffocating darkness of the silver's influence. And then, a voice. Not a sound, but a feeling, an impression directly into her soul. "Alara. Kale. Hold on," the voice urged, filled with a fierce, desperate love that was a balm to her shattered spirit. I feel you. They cannot break what is forged in fate. Hold on. I'm coming. The connection was tenuous, a whisper against a hurricane, but it was there. The void in her soul was no longer absolute. A tiny pinprick of light now existed in the darkness. It was enough. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. He was alive. He was fighting for her. She had to fight too. When Malakor's assassins came for her, she did not struggle. She walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed on that tiny pinprick of light in her soul. They led her from the dungeon to a vast, cavernous hall. A dark, twisted ritual circle was carved into the floor, glowing with a sickly purple light. Malakor stood in the center, waiting for her. "Ready to be broken, little sunstone?" he asked with a smirk. They forced her to her knees at the edge of the circle. The pain from the silver intensified, the oppressive magic of the ritual amplifying its effect. The world began to gray out at the edges. Just as Malakor began the incantation, a sound echoed from far above. A single, mournful howl filled with rage and promise. It was a sound that shook the very foundations of the fortress. Malakor paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. And then, the entire western wall of the chamber exploded inward. Stone and dust erupted as a colossal figure smashed through the wall. It was Kale, but not as she had seen him before. He was in his shifter form, a wolf the size of a grizzly bear, his fur the color of a thundercloud, his eyes blazing furnaces of pure silver. The silver chains were gone, and the wound in his side was nothing but a faint scar. He was rage incarnate. Behind him, his warriors poured through the breach, a tide of fur and claws, their howls joining his in a symphony of glorious war. The battle was instant and brutal. Kale's forces, filled with the righteous fury of their king, tore into the Ember Covenant assassins. Kale, in his terrifying, magnificent form, ignored the lesser fighters. His silver eyes were locked on Malakor. He launched himself across the chamber, a living avalanche of fury. Malakor, for his part, did not flinch. He drew a wicked-looking blade of black, volcanic glass and met the Alpha King's charge. They crashed together in the center of the hall, a whirlwind of light and shadow, claw and blade. Alara could only watch, her heart in her throat. The assassins holding her had been pulled into the fray. She was forgotten for the moment. She tried to scramble away, but the silver manacles were chained to the floor. The fight between the two kings was a battle of titans. Kale was stronger, a raw, physical powerhouse. But Malakor was cunning, using dark magic to deflect and parry, his obsidian blade leaving smoking cuts on Kale's hide. Then, Malakor found an opening. As Kale lunged, Malakor sidestepped and drove his blade deep into Kale's shoulder. Kale roared in pain, staggering back. The obsidian blade seemed to drink the light, and the wound sizzled with dark energy refusing to heal. He fell to one knee, his massive head drooping, his silver eyes dimming with pain. Malakor laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. "The age of the wolf is over," he declared, raising his blade for a final, killing blow. Seeing Kale fall, seeing him wounded and in danger because of her, something inside Alara did not just break. It detonated. The years of being called worthless, the casual cruelty of Lyra, the gnawing hunger, the biting cold, the soul-crushing despair of the dungeon, and the fierce, protective love she felt for the king kneeling in the dirt. All of it, all the pain, all the fear, all the rage, coalesced into a single, blinding point of pressure in her chest. The stubborn little spark she had nurtured for so long roared into an inferno. A scream tore from her throat, but it was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power. A wave of brilliant golden light erupted from her body. It was not heat, it was purity. It was life. It was sunlight and dawn and the first breath of spring. The wave of light washed over the entire chamber. It slammed into the Ember Covenant assassins, and they screamed as the pure energy burned away their shadows, leaving them stunned and smoldering. It washed over Kale's warriors, and their wounds knitted closed. Their strength returned tenfold. It washed over Kale himself, and the dark magic of the obsidian blade was vaporized. His wound healed in a flash of golden light, and his silver eyes flared back to their full, incandescent glory. And the light shattered the silver manacles on Alara's wrists as if they were made of glass. She rose to her feet. She was no longer shivering. She was no longer cowering. Her simple gray tunic seemed to glow, and her eyes, once the color of ash, were now pools of molten gold, mirroring Kale's. The soul brand on her wrist was a blazing star. Malachor stared at her, his handsome face contorted in disbelief and rage. "Impossible," he breathed. "A dormant sunstone cannot wield such power." Alara took a step forward. The floor stones cracked under her feet. "You tried to use me to break him," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she had never known, a power that shook the very air. "But you don't understand the bond. You can't sever a soul. You can only forge it in fire." "You are nothing," he snarled, recovering his composure and raising his blade. "An Omega filth who got lucky." "My name," she declared, her voice resonating with pure, untamed light, "is Alara, and I am his queen." She raised her hand. A spear of solid, golden light formed in her palm. She did not hesitate. She did not doubt. She hurled it. It crossed the chamber in a silent, brilliant arc and struck Malachor square in the chest. He did not even have time to scream. The light consumed him, dissolving his form, his blade, his very shadow, until nothing was left but a faint drift of sterile dust. Silence fell upon the chamber, broken only by the panting of the warriors. The battle was over. Alara stood there, trembling with the aftershock of the power that had flowed through her. Kale, now back in his human form, his body bare and magnificent, his eyes full of stunned awe, rushed to her side. He did not grab her. He did not command her. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch as reverent as a prayer. His thumbs gently stroked her cheeks, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us. You saved me." "I love you," she whispered, the words tumbling out, raw and honest and true. It was the simplest and most profound truth she had ever known. He smiled, that same breathtaking sunrise smile from the clearing. "I have loved you for 1,000 years, and I will love you for 10,000 more." He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss on the blazing soul brand on her wrist. The mark flared with a light so bright it was almost blinding. As it did, a matching mark, a perfect spiral of silver and gold, bloomed into existence on the back of his own hand. The bond was no longer a one-way brand. It was a shared, completed circle. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of possession, but of partnership, of equals. It was a kiss that sealed a bond and promised a future. It was a kiss that tasted of victory, of homecoming, and of a love so profound it could remake the world. When they finally broke apart, he took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, their matching brands pressing together. He led her from the ruined fortress, out into the clean, cold air where his people, his entire pack, had gathered, drawn by the sounds of battle and the flash of golden light. A sea of faces, thousands of them, turned to look at them. They looked at their king, whole and victorious. And they looked at the small, slender woman by his side, her hand in his, her eyes glowing like twin suns.
Kale raised their joined hands high for all to see, the matching marks on their skin glowing for all to see. "Behold your queen!" he roared, his voice echoing across the mountains. "Elara, the light of our people!" A moment of stunned silence, and then a cheer erupted. It was a deafening, joyous roar that shook the very ground. It was a sound of acceptance, of awe, of fealty. Elara looked out at the faces, warriors, elders, mothers, children, and saw no scorn, no pity. She saw only reverence. She saw hope. She was no longer Ash. She was not worthless or invisible or alone. She was Elara. She was a queen. She was loved. Tucked against Kale's side, their hands clasped together, their souls intertwined, she finally, truly, felt like she was home.